Hi everybody, Rick Berk here again with View Filters. I've been a professional photographer for the last 20 years, and for the last 15 I've been an avid landscape photographer as well. Now, most people consider filters for very specific purposes. Polarizers for helping turn the sky bluer, neutral density grads for darkening a bright sky and bringing the exposure of the sky and foreground into a more manageable range, and neutral density filters for slowing down the exposure to control motion, for instance when you want to slow down water and get a nice creamy blur on a waterfall. While those are the basics, there are a few situations that at first glance might not seem right for using a filter. I'm going to tell you about a few of them and show you how you can use view filters in these somewhat unorthodox situations to create more interesting images. As usual, I'm using View Scion filters, and when needed, a remote trigger release. Now, the reason I'm using View Scion filters is the good color consistency that they provide from filter to filter. If I change out a filter for a different kind of shot in the same location, I know that the color is going to be consistent from one filter to the next. I don't have to worry about that in post. They provide me with a lot of different creative options. I can use a neutral density filter to slow down exposure if I'm trying to blur water or cloud movement, and I can use the ND grads, as always, to provide a better dynamic range than I would get without the filters if the sky is very bright and the foreground's very dark. So the filters really help me out quite a bit. I was speaking to a photographer a couple months back about her night photography work. She does a lot of astrophotography, and she was trying to get the stars in the shot while there was a bright foreground also in the scene. And she was having problems with keeping the brighter foreground from blowing out while she exposed for the stars. I suggested that an upside down neutral density grad might be exactly what she needed, and she was actually embarrassed that she hadn't thought of it first. Here, this shot, I was shooting the Perseid meteor shower last summer out at Montauk Point, New York. Now, I knew I wanted the lighthouse in the foreground. It's a brightly lit lighthouse. It's under spotlight, but it's really kind of one of those classic lighthouses that you see overlooking the water on a high cliff. And I thought it would be the perfect foreground for me for the meteor shower. So I went out and found my spot, and I took a shot without the filter, as you see here. And you can see the lighthouse is just completely blown out beyond all recoverability in Photoshop. So I wanted to try and fix that. So I pulled out my ND grads and I got something more like this. Now what I did here was I stacked a 3-stop soft edge ND grad and a 2-stop soft edge ND grad to give me 5 total stops of graduated neutral density. The darker side covered the lower portion of the image, and it brings the lighthouse within range of proper exposure for the image. And I was able to then capture this image with 2 meteors streaking across the sky right over the lighthouse. I couldn't have scripted it any better, and it came out perfect. And just the thought of being able to turn around the neutral density filters, you know, normally, like I said, we think of it at sunrise and sunset when the sky is really bright, but here at night, you know, thankfully I had them in my bag, and I thought, well, I'll darken the lighthouse instead. Now, I did lose some foreground detail because the dark foreground went completely dark, but that wasn't really important to the shot. What was important was that the lighthouse be properly exposed and that I get the sky properly exposed so that I could capture the meteors as they streaked across the sky. So here you can see in a comparison, I've got on the left with no filter, and you can see the skies are fairly comparable, except the one on the right actually has a meteor in it, and the one on the left doesn't. But you can see the lighthouse is drastically different because of the 5 stops of neutral density that I added over the bottom half of the image there. Here's another variation on a similar shot. I moved to a different spot for this shot, but I was able to again do star trails with the lighthouse in a series of continuous shots so that I didn't have to composite the shots together. I was able to shoot about 150 exposures of the stars at about 30 seconds each, and then just combine them in software to get the finished star trail image. But I didn't have to composite the lighthouse into the shot separately. The combined shots on their own through using software was able to give me the exact shot I wanted, and then it was just a matter of color and contrast adjustment, and I was done. I didn't have to take any extra time in Photoshop masking things off and combining them the way I wanted to. That might be fine for some. I just don't like to spend that much time in post if I can help it. So getting the exposure right out in the field really makes a difference to me. Another situation where you might want to use a neutral density filter grad upside down is a shot like this one. This was a shot of the Dallas skyline. I'm standing on an overpass over Interstate 30 outside Dallas, and you've got the skyline and the road leading right to it. And it's a pretty nice shot. But the one problem was the lights from oncoming traffic, the headlights from oncoming traffic, created this really bright hotspot in the scene. And it really kind of draws your eye right to it and overpowers the skyline in the background. I needed to overcome that. So what I did was I added a two-stop soft edge ND grad at the bottom of the image. And again, I was able to subdue the headlights enough that it balanced out the exposure between the headlights and the skyline in the background, and allows the viewer's eyes to move through the scene, through the headlights, and then back to the Dallas skyline without stopping right on that super bright highlight as we had in the first shot. So it really worked out well. Just by turning upside down that ND grad, I was able to balance the image and get the image that I saw when I came upon that scene that way. And you can see the difference here with no filter and the NDG 2S at the bottom. And I had the horizon of the NDG 2S moved up pretty high so that the graduation kind of started just at the bottom of the skyline in the scene, so that it handled the headlights coming on really well. Now, here's an area where it may not be quite so obvious. Lighting was fairly even, but for this waterfall, the trees at the top left were more in shadow, and the whole foreground and the stream were in sunlight. So I had to choose whether I wanted to expose for the foreground and not blow out my highlights and darken the bushes a little bit, or if I wanted to expose the bushes the way I wanted to and possibly blow out the highlights in the foreground. So I opted to properly expose the foreground in this shot, and you can see the bushes are a little dark. They're kind of darker than everything else, and your eye kind of goes right towards that dark area at the top left. By adding a soft edge two-stop neutral density grad to the image, and I rotated the area so that it was kind of on an angle leading from the bottom right corner up to the top left where the gradation cleared, I was able to balance the exposure between the foreground and the background. You can see the bushes opened up a little bit more, and I was still able to get the proper exposure on the water and get a nice soft blur to that waterfall as well. Here in the comparison, again, you can see the difference. It's a more even exposure, and these more even exposures give me a little more room to work when I do get the image into Photoshop and I'm adjusting for color and contrast as I'm editing my images. So I want that freedom to be able to adjust contrast and color the way I want to, rather than be limited by where the camera actually captured the image if it's right at the edge of my histogram.